Our subject for a penned line drawing is this country laneway. The challenge with drawing a scene such as this is always the mass of texture that we have to represent. We want to include enough detail to capture something of the interest of the texture, and yet we don't want to get so tangled up in detail that the whole thing becomes one giant tangle. My plan is to draw this as much by drawing the shadows using hatching and cross hatching as drawing the actual objects. And I'll be trying to map out the relative proportions of the various parts of the drawing as well. But I also want to capture something of the different leaves that the different plants have, and I also want to capture something of foreground, midground and distance to see the various parts and not have them all get joined up together. I love these garden buildings here. They're a wonderful contrast to all this foliage. I'm going to start with this midground just here, and drawing a scene like this, it's important to occasionally stop and stand back and look at the big picture, whether we've created a sense of distinction between here, here and here, whether it's working as a whole and we haven't got too bogged down in doing leaves in one little part. I've also printed off a black and white copy, which I have off camera, but I'm using when I'm doing the hatching just to help me get a sense of the relative values of all of these greens as they're in different parts of the scene, in shade and in shadow. Let's start to draw. So I start with a nice loose line of dots and dashes to start to define some of the broad areas of shape. In this drawing, in this scene, I'm defining shapes both by using positive and negative spaces. I use lines, very loose dotted dashed lines, to define positive spaces, but I also use shading, cross-hatching, to show the shadows, because a lot of the areas are much more easily and accurately defined by the shadows that are there rather than by the actual objects that we can't really see. So it's a great subject for practicing a mixture of positive and negative space drawing. I'm trying to keep everything pretty loose at this stage. This is in the midground, so I'll be drawing things in more detail closer to the front. So I don't want to overdo the detail, but I do want to get a sense of these are shrubs, there are little branches, there are things catching the light. I want to capture some shapes that effectively convey loose, out of control, untamed things as part of the charm of this countryside. This is not a garden. So I then just do some of these closer ones and actually define some leaves. I want to get a sense of foreground here of this being quite close. And so I'm thinking that if I just do a few rough ones now, that will help me see it in this way. And then I start to put the pathway in. Where this path disappears and goes around the corner through the trees really is the focal point, and so I want to get it right. I want to have it in the right place in proportion to the other elements of this drawing. I'm still aligning things with what I've already drawn, even though the objects here aren't as obvious as buildings and windows and roof lines for alignment and the like. It's still important to be comparing where I've put things with where I then go to put things, because I do want to keep the proportions of this the same as in my reference photo. Otherwise it won't quite look right. I want the road to look like it's sitting on the same ground that these other structures and the shrubs and the trees are on. I love these garden buildings. They add a great contrast to the foliage. So I think what I'm drawing now is actually a mass of vines that's on one end of an otherwise collapsed garden building. I'm keeping everything very loose, very light lines. And I'm trying to just work out exactly where to put this arch of trees. So I start to work on the closer part of this tree that arches over the road, as well as wanting to really make sure I've got the arch in the right place. There's a lot of drawing with negative space here, lots of defining spaces through the shadows that are cast on them rather than by the actual objects themselves. I'm still not going as dark as I will go with this hatching. I'm not trying to do the final hatching by any means here, but I am wanting to define areas so that I can use them as a reference for other parts that I need to draw. So trying to make sure I keep things with a nice light touch right up the end. I've switched back and forth between a 0.2 for some of these further parts and the 0.3mm pen that I have been using. So now I start to do some of the other side of the road, and I get a sense of how it lines up with the side of the road I've already drawn. Start to define some of the shadows on the road. It's endless hatching. Great exercise for hatching, doing trees, where that really is how we define everything. Now I'm actually drawing some of the leaves on this closest part of the tree, and that's important because the brain will pick those up, and I don't want them to be super prominent, but it will give a sense of, oh, this tree is somehow closer, this is a bigger plant, this is a tree, just giving enough clues for the brain to see this as a tree and as being closer than other trees or other plants that are there. And then I've got this embankment, which is also a lot of shadows. There's a lot of going back and forth, and just looking to see what part I feel I need to do next to get a sense of this laneway emerging out of the tangle. Always need to keep looking back and seeing the big picture. So not going into final detail in any one part of this at the moment. Still trying to make sure I've just got things in the right place. Fair bit of work on this left bank now. There are some quite deep shadows here. So while I'm not doing my final work on them, I am wanting to make them a bit darker than some of the other parts. And this roadway now needs to be defined a little more. I want to capture the sense of, it's a pretty uneven surface. It's got cracks and creases and all manner of leaf litter and other bits and pieces all over it. And by making them larger in the very front and smaller as they move further back, and just basically dots and specks in the midground, helps to create a sense of distance. So what few objects I have got, leaf litter and stones, are important to use for a sense of scale as things move backwards. So just really now working on some of these darker areas, because I'll need those as a reference when I work on some other areas as well. I want to have a sense of the general direction of the sun coming down from the top right. A little more work on the roadway here. And now I switch to a 0.5 pen just to get some of these darker areas hatched a little more quickly. Plus I want to use this now for the foreground plants where I want to do more leaves, have some darker shadows and more detail to create the sense of this is closer than the things behind it. I'm not at all trying to do a faithful representation of the weeds that are in the actual photo. I just want to create a sense of there are plants that are closer to us here, and we can see some of the individual leaves. While I've got this thicker pen, the 0.5mm, I'm just adding some more lines to things. And back to my 0.3. Well, the overall scene is starting to come into place now. We have an archway, and while I'll define the darks a little more later, I want to now get the rest of this mass of trees in place. I've switched to a 0.2mm pen now because I want it to have a bit of a lighter feel to it. Drawing with a light touch, mostly just drawing with some very simple dashed and dotted lines and much lighter hatching than I've used before. I have this large tree. This is probably the part of the drawing I'm least happy with. I just was a bit heavy-handed with it. These wonderful dry stone walls that are all over Yorkshire. Put a little bit of texture onto the field to have a sense of closer field and further field. A few more details to these greenhouses and that I hadn't put in before. And now I'm just finishing this foreground trees with more hatching. There's a lot of looking at the overall scene now and working out what parts do I want to go darker in just to create a better cohesion with the whole thing. A little more work up here. Had the camera off for a few moments. When I did some work up here later, you'll see it suddenly appear at the end, so sorry about that. This is where you feel like you could keep drawing forever. The thing I'm really trying to do now is to help define these broader, larger areas that are important to being able to read the scene and step through it. Trying to make separate parts a bit clearer. Strengthening outlines, strengthening the darkest darks, putting light hatching over some areas to join them up with other areas I want them to be joined with. And all the time trying not to go over these spaces I've preserved. And here we have it, pretty much at the end now. What do you think? And this is our drawing. It's always hard to know when to stop with a scene such as this. I look at this now even, and I can still see parts I'm tempted to put some line work on. But overall, I'm happy with the way I've maintained a sense of light falling on this section particularly, of this side of the road being a bit more in shade, of creating various bands of foliage that just help us to step back through the scene with a sense of depth. Happy with the way this pathway has turned out, and I love the contrast that these buildings are. It's been wonderful doing a drawing where the buildings are very much the support act and the foliage, the trees and the plants are the star attraction. So why not have a go at something such as this? I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting. I'll see you next time. Bye.